The interrogation chamber aboard the orbital station, Vigil, hummed with an electric tension. Harsh white light reflected off polished metal surfaces, illuminating the four figures at its center. 3 stood in a semicircle, their shadows stretching across the floor toward the fourth. A human male who sat bound to a chair, his wrists and ankles secured by gleaming psionic dampeners. Jake Carson, trade envoy to the Outer Rim territories, met the gaze of his captors with remarkable composure. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his eyes remained clear and focused. He had been in this chamber for 72 standard hours, yet showed no signs of breaking. "I'll ask once more," said Ambassador Vrax, his insectoid mandibles clicking with irritation. The thylakoid diplomat's carapace gleamed under the lights as he gestured toward a hovering array of devices. "You will cease these inquiries about Sector 12 immediately. The Preservation Council has designated it a quarantine zone for reasons beyond your security clearance." To Vrax's right stood Counselor Lyra, her crystalline form refracting light in prismatic patterns across the chamber. The Lumidian representative's voice resonated with harmonic overtones as she spoke. "Mr. Carson, please understand, this persistence endangers not just yourself, but potentially billions of lives across 17 systems." "Enough talk," growled General Torak, the massive reptilian figure looming on Vrax's left. His scaled hide bore ceremonial scars marking his rank in the draconian military hierarchy. "Humans respond to pain. Let us proceed with neural extraction." He moved toward a console, taloned fingers hovering over the controls. Jake Carson smiled thinly. "Before you turn me into a vegetable, you might want to explain why the quarantine boundaries of Sector 12 have been secretly expanded 6 times in the last decade." The chamber fell silent. The 3 delegates exchanged glances, a ripple of unease passing between them. "You're bluffing," Vrax said finally, though his mandibles twitched nervously. "Am I?" Jake's smile widened. "Just like I'm bluffing about the collective nightmares plaguing the ruling castes on all your worlds? Or the 17 amendments to the Treaty of Borealis that were never brought before the Assembly?" Counselor Lyra's crystalline form dimmed slightly. "How could you possibly? You think humans are just curious monkeys playing at galactic politics." Jake interrupted, leaning forward against his restraints. "But while your species were busy building walls around dangerous knowledge, we were building doors." General Torak slammed a fist against the console. "This human has accessed restricted archives. Security breach in—" "Too late," Jake said calmly. "I'm not here for negotiations. I'm here for answers." The overhead lights flickered. On the far wall, a holographic display sprang to life, cycling through classified documents faster than the alien delegates could react. The chamber's security systems whined in protest as firewalls collapsed and emergency protocols were overridden. "What have you done?" Vrax demanded, his exoskeleton rattling with agitation. "I haven't done anything yet," Jake replied. "But my ship has just completed a distributed systems hack into your precious Preservation Council archives. Unless you start talking, every inhabited world in the Alliance receives full disclosure in exactly 10 minutes. Counselor Lyra moved closer to Jake, her crystalline form pulsing with urgency. "You don't understand what you're threatening to unleash. There are reasons, good reasons, why certain knowledge is contained." "Contained?" Jake laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call it? The mass production of Serenity 7 to suppress cognitive functions in your own populations? The memory wipes? The philosophical inoculations administered to children?" General Torak drew himself to his full height, towering over the seated human. "Our civilizations were nearly destroyed by the Deep Inquiry catastrophe. We survived only by establishing boundaries around certain questions." "Ah, there it is." Jake nodded. "Finally, some honesty. Tell me about the Deep Inquiry." The 3 delegates conferred in hushed tones, their ancient languages blending in a cacophony of clicks, harmonics, and hisses. Meanwhile, the holographic display continued cycling through restricted files, occasionally freezing on particularly damning evidence, pharmaceutical formulas, quarantine expansion orders, brain scans showing artificial neural inhibition. Finally, Ambassador Vrax turned back to Jake. Releasing this information would cause civilizational collapse across multiple systems. We cannot allow. A piercing alarm cut through the chamber. Red emergency lights bathed the room in crimson as a mechanical voice announced. Vault access detected, quarantine protocols compromised, Sector 12 containment failure imminent. He's opened the historical archives. Lyra gasped, her crystalline form pulsating with distress. The holographic display shifted, now showing footage from centuries earlier. The images were fragmented, corrupted by time or deliberate tampering. But clear enough. A lush world, covered in sprawling cities of impossible architecture, the Aerodal civilization at its peak. Then, frame by frame, the cities began to unravel, not through violence or natural disaster, but in a more fundamental way. Buildings losing cohesion, matter itself seeming to question its own existence. In the final frames, an entire planet simply ceased to be, leaving only a void where a thriving civilization had once existed. The Aerodal asked questions no sentient beings should ask. General Torak said grimly. Their philosophers and scientists pushed beyond safe cognitive boundaries. They asked, why exist? Not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a fundamental inquiry into the nature of reality itself. And reality answered, Lyra added softly. Or rather, it failed to provide a sufficient answer, and in that vacuum of meaning, they unmade themselves. Vrax finished. Not just their bodies or their civilization, but the very concept of their existence. Sector 12 contains what remains of that inquiry, a wound in the fabric of understanding that could spread if disturbed. Jake absorbed this information, his expression unreadable. So you established the Preservation Council to prevent anyone else from asking these dangerous questions. To save countless lives, Lyra insisted. To prevent other civilizations from following the Aerodal into oblivion. By keeping them ignorant, Jake countered. By drugging them into intellectual complacency. By treating curiosity as a disease to be managed rather than a faculty to be developed. The alarm suddenly changed pitch, becoming a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the station. The holographic display went dark, then relit with a single pulsing symbol, ancient and complex, shifting between different writing systems as if language itself struggled to contain its meaning. What's happening? Jake demanded, straining against his restraints. Terror transformed the faces of the three delegates. General Torak was already backing toward the exit, while Ambassador Vrax's mandibles clicked in a rapid pattern that suggested panic. Only Counselor Lyra remained relatively composed, though her crystalline form had dimmed to a dull glow. You've done it, she whispered. Your inquiries, your access to the archives, you've awakened the quarantine entity. The air in the center of the chamber began to shimmer and distort. Reality itself seemed to fold inward, creating a vortex of light and shadow from which emerged something. Not solid, not energy, but a living web of connections. Thoughts turned tangible. Questions transformed into answers that birthed new questions. Gravity inverted. The three delegates found themselves pinned to the ceiling, while Jake's restraints dissolved into liquid metal that flowed upward. Only Jake himself remained seated, now apparently at the center of a localized field that preserved normal physics. What is this? Jake asked, staring at the manifestation before him. The entity pulsed in response, sending ripples of meaning rather than sound throughout the chamber. Each delegate perceived these ripples differently. Vrax heard them as mathematical equations that contradicted themselves yet somehow remained true. Lyra experienced them as musical harmonies that altered her very molecular structure. Torak saw battlefield strategies that encompassed moves in dimensions he couldn't comprehend. Jake, however, understood perfectly. You're what remains of the Aerodal, he said with growing wonder. Not their destruction, but their transcendence. The entity pulsed again, confirming. Jake stood, now free of his restraints, and addressed the three terrified delegates. They didn't unmake themselves through dangerous questions. They evolved beyond the limitations of physical existence by asking every question, and receiving every answer. Impossible. Vrax chittered from his position on the ceiling. The Preservation Council records clearly show what your ancestors wanted you to believe. Jake interrupted. They feared what they couldn't control, couldn't understand, so they quarantined not a danger, but an opportunity. The entity expanded, filling more of the chamber with its web-like structure. Reality continued to bend around it, the laws of physics becoming suggestions rather than rules. Force fields dissolved, security systems deactivated, and the very atomic structure of the station began to rearrange itself into more elegant, efficient patterns. General Torak, still struggling against the inverted gravity, roared in defiance. This is exactly why such knowledge must be contained. Look at what it's doing to the station, to reality itself. It's not destroying, Counselor Lyra said suddenly, her voice filled with dawning comprehension. It's improving. Jake nodded. The Aerodol didn't ask why exist as a nihilistic challenge to reality. They asked it as the first step toward answering, how might we exist better? He turned to face the entity directly, standing at the threshold between ordinary space and whatever domain this being now inhabited. But there's still one question left, isn't there? The question that even the Aerodol hesitated to ask fully. The entity pulsed with anticipation. Jake took a deep breath and spoke the words that would reshape galactic understanding forever. What happens when one who asks every question gets every answer? The chamber, the station, perhaps reality itself seemed to hold its breath. The entity expanded explosively, its web-like structure extending beyond the visible spectrum, beyond the chamber, beyond the station. For one terrifying moment, it seemed as though all of existence might unravel. Then, just as suddenly, coherence returned. The delegates floated gently down from the ceiling. The entity contracted, taking a more defined form, still not solid, not quite energy, but more comprehensible to organic minds. Understanding came a voice that was somehow both singular and collective. Not merely knowledge accumulated, but wisdom integrated, not power seized, but responsibility embraced. Ambassador Vrax struggled to his feet, mandibles working in confusion. What? What are you? We were the Aerodol, the entity responded. We are now the Curiosity Collective. We have been waiting for a species capable of asking the right questions without fearing the answers. The holographic display activated once more, this time showing not destruction, but transformation. The historical records continued where they had been cut off, revealing the truth. The Aerodol civilization hadn't been destroyed, but had evolved, transcending physical limitations while preserving their essential curiosity and compassion. More footage appeared, showing other species that had been quarantined in various sectors, not extinct as official records claimed, but integrated into the collective after discovering similar paths to transcendence. The Morrigan, Lyra gasped, recognizing an ancient enemy of her people. The Solari Conclave, the Vox Imperialis, all supposedly destroyed in cognitive collapse events. All transformed, Jake corrected, all part of something greater now. General Torak sank to his knees, his military bearing crumbling in the face of this revelation. Then, the Preservation Council has been wrong all along. We've been preventing evolution rather than extinction. Not entirely wrong, the entity interjected, its voice carrying neither judgment nor condemnation. Not all species are ready. Some questions, asked without proper foundation or ethical framework, can indeed lead to destruction. The Aerodol themselves nearly followed that path. What changed for them? Lyra asked. They encountered human thought. Jake answered, the pieces finally falling into place in his mind. Not modern humans, but ancient Earth philosophers, data transmitted into deep space thousands of years ago. They found something in human curiosity that balanced their own tendency toward pure abstraction. The entity pulsed in confirmation. Human inquiry is unique in the known universe, simultaneously rigorous and playful, structured and creative. You ask not just why, but why not? Not just what is, but what if? This balance prevents the cognitive dissolution that pure abstraction can cause. Ambassador Vrax stepped forward, his initial fear giving way to diplomatic calculation. If what you say is true, why has the collective remained hidden all these centuries? Why allow the quarantines to stand? Because forcing understanding before a species is ready causes harm, the entity replied. Each civilization must discover its own path to the questions that matter. Some require more time than others. Jake turned to face the three delegates directly. That's why I'm here. Humanity has been monitoring the Preservation Council for generations, waiting for the right moment. Your species are ready now, or at least, ready to begin asking better questions. What are you proposing? Lyra asked, her crystalline structure brightening with cautious hope. An end to the quarantines, Jake said simply. An end to the suppression of curiosity. Not an immediate disclosure of all knowledge, that would indeed be dangerous, but a guided path of inquiry, with humanity and the collective serving as mentors rather than gatekeepers. General Torak, ever the strategist, narrowed his eyes. And if we refuse? The entity pulsed once, and the holographic display showed countless human ships positioned throughout the galaxy, each stationed near a quarantine zone, not as a threat, but as a statement of commitment. Then we proceed without you, Jake said without malice. Humanity has already begun dismantling the quarantines. We would prefer to work with the Preservation Council rather than against it, but we will not allow artificial constraints on curiosity to stand any longer. For several moments, the chamber was silent save for the subtle humming of the entity's presence. The three delegates conferred again, this time with less panic and more purposeful consideration. Finally, Ambassador Vrax stepped forward. The Preservation Council was founded on the principle of safeguarding sentient life throughout the galaxy. If our methods have been misguided, if we have been preserving stagnation rather than preventing destruction, then we must reconsider our approach. The Lumidians have always valued illumination, Lyra added, her form glowing more brightly. Perhaps it is time we seek it more actively rather than simply preserving what light we already possess. General Torak was the last to speak, his military mind requiring more time to adjust to this paradigm shift. The Draconians prepare for all contingencies, he said finally. We failed to prepare for this one. That failure suggests our understanding was incomplete. He straightened to his full height. I will advise the High Command that new strategies are required, strategies of exploration rather than containment. The entity pulsed with what might have been approval. Its web-like structure began to recede, folding back into dimensions beyond ordinary perception. Before vanishing completely, it left a gift, a small crystalline object hovering in the center of the chamber. The guidance protocol, the entity's voice explained, not answers, but methods for asking better questions. A beginning. As the last traces of the entity disappeared, the station's systems returned to normal function. The emergency lights faded, replaced by the standard illumination. The only evidence of what had transpired was the crystalline object and the transformed understanding of those present. Jake Carson reached out and took the object, feeling its weight in his palm. The real work begins now, he said. Dismantling centuries of fear won't happen overnight. What exactly are you proposing? Ambassador Vrax asked. Practical concerns returning now that the immediate crisis had passed. A new council, Jake replied. Not for preservation, but for exploration. Not guardians of boundaries, but guides for those ready to transcend them. Each species progressing at its own pace, but none artificially held back. And the quarantine zones? General Torak inquired. Renamed as transcendence thresholds, Jake suggested. Approached with caution and wisdom, not fear and ignorance, with proper preparation, they represent opportunities rather than threats. Counselor Lyra's crystalline form resonated with harmonics that suggested deep contemplation. The implications for our civilizations are profound. There will be resistance. Change on this scale frightens even the most progressive minds. Which is why we proceed carefully, Jake assured her. This isn't about forcing transformation, but about removing artificial barriers to natural growth. Some individuals, some communities, perhaps even some species will choose to remain as they are, and that choice must be respected. Over the next several hours, as the station continued its orbit above the region formerly known as Sector 12, the four representatives drafted the preliminary framework for a new galactic order. The Preservation Council would be formally disbanded, its resources redirected toward the newly established Inquiry Guidance Initiative. Ambassador Vrax. His initial hostility transformed into cautious diplomacy, focused on the political transitions necessary to implement these changes without causing chaos. General Torak, still somewhat skeptical but adaptable as any good military mind must be, developed security protocols to manage the controlled dissolution of quarantine barriers. Counselor Lyra, perhaps the most receptive to these new ideas, began formulating educational approaches to prepare populations for expanded cognitive horizons. As for Jake Carson, he served as both human representative and intermediary with the Curiosity Collective, whose subtle presence remained detectable to those now aware of it. The crystalline object, the guidance protocol, would be studied, duplicated, and eventually distributed to research institutions throughout Allied space. There's one thing I still don't understand, Counselor Lyra said as they finalized the initial agreements. Why did the collective choose now to reveal itself? What changed? Jake smiled. We asked. Humans have been asking about the quarantine zones for centuries, Ambassador Vrax pointed out, his mandibles clicking in a pattern that suggested puzzlement. Yes, but we weren't just asking about them, Jake clarified. We were asking them, directing our questions not at the mystery, but at the consciousness within it, inviting dialogue rather than demanding answers. General Torak rumbled thoughtfully. A distinction that would never have occurred to the Draconan approach. Nor to the Thelicoid, Vrax admitted. Perhaps not even to the Lumidian, Lyra added. Despite our philosophical traditions, Jake gestured to the space where the entity had manifested. That's why the collective believes humanity has a role to play in this transition. Not because we're inherently superior, we're not, but because our particular style of inquiry complements the approaches of other species. Together, we ask better questions than any of us could alone. As the orbital station completed another revolution, the four representatives stood before the vast viewport, gazing down at the shimmering anomaly that had once been feared as a wound in reality, but was now understood as a doorway to greater understanding. What will we find, I wonder? Lyra mused. As we begin asking these better questions? That, Jake replied, is precisely the question we should be asking. In the months and years that followed, the dissolution of the quarantine system proceeded gradually, carefully. Some worlds embraced the new paradigm eagerly, their populations blossoming with renewed intellectual and creative energy. Others approached the change more cautiously, implementing safeguards and progressive exposure protocols. The Curiosity Collective maintained its subtle presence, neither interfering directly nor remaining completely detached. The transcended consciousness of countless former civilizations served not as gods or rulers, but as guides and companions for species still navigating physical existence. Humanity's role evolved as well. No longer merely traders or diplomats on the galactic stage, they became teachers of a uniquely balanced approach to inquiry, showing other species how to question fundamental assumptions without losing their existential footing. And Jake Carson, once a prisoner in an interrogation chamber, found himself transformed into something else entirely. Not quite human anymore, not quite transcended, but a bridge between states of being. His final question had indeed ended one debate permanently, but it had started countless others, debates not of fear and restriction, but of possibility and potential. Throughout 17 systems and beyond, sentient beings looked up at their night skies with new understanding. The stars were no longer just distant lights or navigational references, but waypoints on a journey of infinite questioning. The boundaries of knowledge had not disappeared. They had simply been recognized as horizons rather than walls, forever receding as one approached, forever inviting the next question, and the next, and the next. And in the space once known as Sector 12, where the Eridol had first transcended the limitations of physical existence, reality itself seemed to pulse with an ancient truth newly rediscovered, that the universe is not a puzzle to be solved or a threat to be contained, but a question to be lived.